All right, welcome. Thanks for being here. I'm Emilie with Appalachian Sustainable Development, and I host the Ask an Agroforester webinar series. Thanks to all of you for showing up and supporting. We'll introduce Zach a little more in just a couple minutes, but I'm here with Zach Elfers today. Welcome. We're going to be talking about hickories, and I'm really excited for this session. We've been kind of chatting informally about it for a while, and it's nice to have the opportunity to share it with everybody. So here's where we're headed. We are in welcome mode. I'm going to introduce you to ASD, and then we're going to get into the good stuff. I'll introduce you to Zach, and we'll move into his presentation and then the Q&A. Just want to shout out to all the wonderful people that are making the collaboration of Ask an Agroforester possible this season. The Edwards Mother Earth Foundation, namely, is our funder for this program, but we've also had a lot of individual donations, so thanks for everybody that donates while they're registering. We've also got all these wonderful farms and orgs participating, including Future Forest Plants of Mr. Zach Elfers, and we will discuss that even more shortly. Don't forget to join us next Monday. We've got Willow for Every Farm with Sarah Lasswell of Moss and Thistle Farm. She's outside of Asheville and does casquetry work with willow and does a lot of willow growing. And Howard Peller of Living Willow Farm in Ohio. And Howard's been growing and producing and crafting. I think he's been crafting most of his life, but he's been growing and producing for the last, I think, 20 years. And he has done really interesting work all over the world. So that should be a really fun session, and I hope that you'll join us to nerd out about willows. All right, a little about ASD, your hosts today. We are growing a stronger Appalachia through agriculture, and that can look like a lot of things, but our work falls into 5 main categories. So we have workforce development, which is work that we do with folks who have maybe barriers to entering the work field. So folks with prior incarceration or substance abuse or maybe houselessness or haven't finished an education. We train those folks into different sectors of the ag fields. We also work in agriculture education with all kinds of folks. We have hospital gardens and we have school gardens and community gardens. We have a veterans program that specifically works with that population and helps donate for raised beds. We also have a food access program that does work with a lot of food boxes, which we'll see stats on in a minute. We also do economic development, helping people farm plan and also helping folks figure out how to get their businesses started up. And then resource management, which is where agroforestry lives in that sort of corner of the organization, although all of these kind of overlap into each other. But those are sort of like our 5 main buckets of work. To date, we have over $40 million in produce, beef, and value-added products that we've been able to sell and distribute in the region, which is really, really amazing. And we've been around for 30 years. So we've been working hard. We've been able to help new farmers and gardeners grow over 170,000 pounds of food. We've installed close to 300 now raised beds at schools, clubs, and through our veterans program, preserved over 5,000 acres of forest land, helped train and support more than 5,000 farmers through resources and programming. And then through our food box program, donated over 10 million pounds of local and regional food to area food pantries. And that's actually one of our newer programs. So that's kind of, to me, that's a really exciting number because that's something that we haven't been working on for all that long. And we've already been able to have a really strong impact there. If you're interested in agroforestry or in ASD, check out our website. The Agroforestry page has all kinds of resources, including can point you to some of the grants that I'll be mentioning in a minute. You can find the links to the Ask an Agroforester YouTube playlist. You can find all kinds of stuff there. The funding opportunities I want to just hype for a moment are the Catalyzing Agroforestry Grant Program and the Assets Grant Program. The Assets Grant Program is geared towards silvopasture by addition. So we can't do silvopasture by thinning, but we can do silvopasture by addition with this grant. And it's a financial support, a financial assistance grant program for farmers who are planting new silvopastures. And it can be paired with a carbon credit for long-term financial assistance, or just like a little financial boost for to help you take care of and prioritize and fund that project into the long term. We also have the Catalyzing Agroforestry Grant Program that we work on with Virginia Tech. That grant program is nationwide, which is really cool. And you can apply for grant funding assistance with any of the 5 agroforestry practices or anything that might sort of like be between the lines. Like anything that's under that umbrella can be applied for this grant. So that's a really nice open-ended grant. That's also funded by the Edwards Mother Earth Foundation. So because it's that private foundation funding, it's really flexible, which is nice. Also, EMEF funding, we have the agroforestry trainings for natural resources professionals. So if this kind of stuff is really interesting to you, this technical knowledge, especially if you're in the natural resources space, if you work with farmers, if you are helping people plan any type of agricultural projects, maybe you work for extension or soil and water, NRCS or forestry, these are really great trainings for you. And we have 100 and 200 level trainings in several different practices in lots of different locations throughout the year. So please check those out. And you can also go to learnagroforestry.com and there are remote trainings that you can do. And those are really excellent. They're like $20 per module, and the modules are like many, many hours long. The Silvopasture one is like 20 hours long or something like that. So you're not going to find more condensed, cost-effective information all in one place, I don't think, if you're a natural resources person or if you're just a farmer who's like really interested in details. Just a shout out to Giving Tuesday. I know this is coming up for everybody, and I know we're all being asked to put many different places, but if you like the work we're doing and you are interested in supporting it, now through the 2nd of December, we are able to match people's donations one-to-one up to $45,000. So we're trying to hit the $90,000 mark this year. I think we were around 80,000 last year. So we're trying to top that out. But if you feel called to, please consider sharing with ASD. And thanks for tuning in this fall. We have 2 more episodes after today. We've got Willow, which I talked about, and then Grassroots Tree Search by farmers for farmers with 2 of the folks at Bread Tree Farms, which is a really exciting new cooperative group of farms. And so we're super looking forward to talking with them about their work. I just want to say hello and welcome to Zach Elfers, who's a tree crops enthusiast and lifelong student of nature. He has a small nursery, Future Forest Plants, in Pennsylvania. And hickories, persimmons, honey locusts have been the main features in his tree crop exploration, selection, and breeding endeavors. And I'm so happy to have Zach here. If you are not familiar with him and you enjoy today's session, you can hop onto the YouTube playlist and check out the honey locust session that we did together last year. And he's a great guest to have on. He's a great guy to have around. We've gotten to work collaboratively a little bit over the last couple of years, and I've just been really enjoying getting to learn from him. So I'm so happy to have him here so y'all can learn from him too. So welcome, Zach.
Cool. Yeah. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Emily. It's great to be here. So this is the big topic, hickory trees. It's one of hickories are my all-time favorite tree crop, by far. And I feel like I could talk about them for hours and really get into the weeds and, ramble around and in the various discourse that, can feature around these trees. But I do have to keep my presentation portion somewhat brief here, about 20 minutes, 25 minutes maybe. So we're going to sort of do an accelerated tour here, but this is a Q&A based discussion. So please bring your questions, your interests, your passions, whatever you're dying to have discussed here, and we'll have the majority of the session for all of that stuff. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So let's dive in here. So hickories is keystones of the tree economy. I'm just going to give a brief bio of myself. I've been in the horticulture world for about 15 years, and so that's been horticulture/agriculture. So I kind of cut my teeth doing nursery work, native plant propagation, got into tree crops and agroforestry, and I also like to do some small scale traditional plant breeding of just various things that interest me. My nursery is Future Forest Plants. I also do some writing. I haven't been able to do much in the past couple of years because I've just been so busy, and it's just hard to do everything that you want to do. But I do have a blog at nomadseed.com. You can find me now on Substack, and I'm interested in ethnobotany, ecology, anthropology, archaeology, culture, and all these intersections. I also work with the Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative, and I'm a member of the Pennsylvania Nut Growers Association and Northern Nut Growers Association. So to begin with, I'm going to share my first memory of hickory trees. This was when I was a kid. So that's my Uncle Bill there on the tractor. He was my grandfather's brother, and my grandfather passed before I was born, so I never met him, but I had my Uncle Bill. And I remember when I was a kid, I went into his garage and there was a bushel basket, and it was stuffed with these huge hickory nuts. And of course, being a kid and not really being raised in a world like this, I didn't really think too much about it until I was an adult and got interested into hickories on my own. And I look back at that memory and very fondly. So he had a shellbark hickory tree that he planted in his backyard that came from the old family gathering place. So this was in rural Washington County, Maryland, on the side of South Mountain. But my real initiation to hickories began around 2014. At the time, I was in a long-term house sitting situation outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. That's my dog in the picture there. He has nothing to do with hickories other than that he likes eating them too, and I just wanted an excuse to put him in. But anyway, I was living on this farm along the Meachams River, and that fall, the woods was just totally filled with mockernuts. And I just totally fell in love with them. It was something about the smell, it was about the color. You can see how they kind of match the color pattern of the leaves, the fallen leaves. And I just started picking them up in buckets, and I would sit there by the wood stove and I would crack them with a hammer or the back of my hatchet. And mocker nuts are very, very hard to extract kernels from. Anyone who's tried to work with them knows exactly how fitting the name mocker nut is. It's the nut that mocks you because the kernels are so sweet and so delicious, but they're so hard to get out of there. But it didn't matter. I just fell in love with them and wanted to work with them anyway. And then I learned about hickory milk, which in Algonquian would be something like Paco hicora. And forgive my pronunciation. Hickory milk is just a great way to take advantage of species like Mockernut hickory and some of the wild shagbarks. Basically, a hickory nut where it's more trouble than it's worth to sit there and try to shell each one out. You can just pulverize them in mass and put them in water, bring it to a boil or to a simmer. So I put them on the wood stove there. All the bits of kernel pieces float and all the shell pieces settle to the bottom. You can either skim the kernels off and eat them or bake with them or dehydrate them or whatever you want to do, or you can just let it be and just drink that really rich broth. The flavor is just incredible. I hope you all have the chance to experience hickory milk someday. It's just, it, I mean, the smell as it wafts through the house and that rich flavor, there's nothing like it. So, I had already fallen in love with the hickory tree, and this was just, a really great way to consume them. And then two falls later, I was introduced to the John Hershey nursery through my friend Dale, and we were in turn introduced through our friend Max Pascal. So I'll talk about that later. But I want to give this little personal piece into how I got into hickories, and then trace the development until where I got to now. So I'm going to start talking about kernels. So everybody's familiar with pecans. I mean, there's nothing more American than pecan pie. And you can get pecan kernels in almost any grocery store. So these are Shagbark Hickory kernels. Now, admittedly, this is from a cultivar. This is from Granger, which is considered like the standard best Shagbark Hickory cultivar that's out there. These are large nuts. They're fairly larger than a quarter, significantly larger than a quarter, maybe like almost like half dollar sized, some of them. And the shells are thin. They shell really easily. The shells are still a little bit tougher than a pecan, especially with the way their geometry is. Like a pecan tends to be more smooth, but they're about as easy to shell as a pecan. And so it sort of begs the question, why do we have an industry based around pecan, but not around shagbark hickory nuts like this? I will point out also that the wild shagbarks often don't shell this well, and even when they do, they're often much smaller. But regardless, they're just incredible nuts. Great flavor. Anyone who has tried a shagbark hickory nut, almost anybody, will agree that it's the best flavored nut in the world. So don't take my word for it. Many people say this. I hope you get the chance to try a shagbark hickory nut because there's nothing like it. If you think a pecan is good, imagine that flavor, but with like overtones of maple. It just sort of like a density there, where a pecan is more buttery and it's more simple in that sense. The shagbark has the same kind of buttery quality, but it's just really rich. So how do you crack a nut effectively? Nutcrackers are essential tools. The two best ones I've ever encountered are the Master Nutcracker, which was produced by Gerald Gardner, and then the CE Potter Nutcracker. You can get the Potter Nutcrackers on eBay sometimes. So just a quick plug here, if I can be brief. Gerald Gardner is in his late 90s and he's in hospice, and it's likely that he'll never really produce another Master Nutcracker again. So the Pennsylvania Nut Growers Association, we wrote him a letter and communicated with him, and we're like, hey, we'd like to, you know, reproduce your Nutcracker because it's the best around, and people want to have this thing. And after some back and forth, we sort of agreed to make a replica of it. So it's slightly modified, but it can be yours for about $120, and they'll probably be available January 1st. We're doing a run of 200. So anyway, that plug is over, but really we're talking about agroforestry. And so, there's sort of two camps here. One is the backyard enthusiast camp, which is I sort of fall into both categories. The backyard enthusiast might have a nutcracker or two at home, and they might have a few trees or more, and they'll primarily gather the nuts for personal use, and they might spend their time in the winter, maybe in front of the wood stove or watching movies or whatever, just cracking out hickory nuts and putting them away and baking them into pies or eating them. And but it's a very personal relationship. It's a very small scale relationship. So that's been going on for hundreds of years. I mean, truthfully, thousands of years. But when we talk about agroforestry, we really are talking about economies of scale and larger orchards. And so this sort of brings up some questions. How can we crack nuts at an industrial scale with precision and reduce some of the labor, the intense hand labor that's involved here? So there are some solutions out there. None of them are terribly efficient. Some are kind of moderately efficient. In the bottom right, you've got the Patriot Nutcracker, which is fine if you just want like a quick and dirty, mass cracking of nuts, but it's going to be hard to get a lot of half kernels out of there. You'll get a lot of quarter kernels and smaller. So my friend Alex Tankey is working on a design for what he calls the lineage Nutcracker, and that's in the upper right hand corner. And the idea is that this would be a machine that can crack a nut as perfectly as can be done by hand, like in the previous slides where I was showing this. And so hopefully he can, come up with an answer for that. Anyway, there's a big opportunity here for the development of new farm tech, which is going to be really essential in turning this into an industry so that we can have, shagbark and shellbark hickory nuts easily accessible in local markets everywhere. I think cooperatives are really important in filling this niche, especially in these early years where we're developing processing capacity and building up markets. But I need to move quickly here. Yellowbud hickory oil is the big new exciting thing out there in agroforestry. There's been a nutritional analysis done on yellowbud hickory oil. It's considered that you want the ratio of omega-6 fatty acids to omega-3 fatty acids to be as close to 1 to 1 as possible. And generally, the range that's ideal for human health is 4 to 1. So the ratio of yellowbud hickory oil is 4 to 1, which beats out olive oil. The best olive oil on the market is like a ratio of 6 to 1. So, in other words, this means that yellowbud hickory oil is the healthiest seed oil that's known to humans, which is a pretty big deal. But, here's one of the uses, one of the classic uses of hickory nuts. Everybody loves pecan pie. Well, how about shagbark hickory pie? And then there's miscellaneous non-timber forest products. I mentioned nut milk already, but some people make a syrup from the bark or from the shells. You can use the press cake from like hickory oil production, for example, as a smoking fuel for smoking meats, cheeses, things of that sort. You can harvest the unripe nuts to make a nocino. And then there's also medicinal markets. So there are uses for the leaves as tea. There are uses for just various aspects of the tree, up to and including the nut for those purposes. So I'm not going to talk about that too much, but I do want to talk about some of the history and just give a big overview. So I sort of led with this question earlier, like why do we have a industry based around pecans, but not around shagbark hickories? So, the emergence of the pecan industry is really a pretty recent development in terms of historical timelines. I mean, it really began in the early 20th century, right around 1900, 1905. Prior to that date, pecans were, on the whole, like a semi-managed wild crop resource. And so all across the South, you had these plantations, but also you had a lot of ranches, like in Texas, Oklahoma, um, parts of Louisiana, for example, where you would have a lot of pecan trees in Savannah, and there'd be prairie grasslands all around these pecans. And so, pecans were kind of a curiosity, and these plantation owners and ranchers would have them and try to build markets for them. And that sometimes they would get shipped into the northern cities, and they're sort of they were never really a hugely economically viable crop. However, when the railroads were built in the late 1800s, that facilitated the movement of pecans around the landscape much easier. And that sort of built more of a market for pecans, which then inspired folks in Florida, Alabama, Georgia, basically east of pecan's natural range, to start planting pecans as a crop. And so Hershey's mentor, J.F. Jones, was one of the pioneers involved in this work. I won't talk about that too much, but this is sort of like, it was sort of an incident of history that this pecan industry emerged. And at the same time, there was a push among the Northern Nut Growers Association members to focus on northern nut growing. Basically, what happened is, because the land in the northern valleys was richer agricultural land, a lot of the pre-existing hickory forests, which were already there, had been destroyed from timbering, and the roots were grubbed out and turned into annually cropped fields. So we had sort of destroyed that existing natural resource. But the other aspect was that the land was more valuable as annual crop land than as something planted out in trees. And so, while the pecans were able to maintain a foothold in the economy, the shagbarks and the shellbarks just couldn't really keep up. But now, hopefully the tables are turned at this moment in history, and we can have an opportunity to succeed where that did not happen in the past. So where do we go from here? So I like to think, rather than adapting our tree growing to the market that exists, we need to start adapting our markets to the trees that are already growing. So we've got tons of wild nut trees in general. I mean, I'm not going to mention black walnuts, but lots of shagbarks, lots of shellbarks in particular areas. And we can utilize these trees to build market and processing capacity. And then that kind of stimulates the planting of more orchards under an agroforestry system. And of course, there's the farm tech innovation that'll be necessary here. So there are 13 species of hickory in North America. There's four in the Apocaria section, which is also known as the water hickories. So that includes water hickory, Hickory aquatica, the Mexican hickory, yellowbud or bitternut hickory, and the pecan. And then there's nine in the Carius section, which is considered the true hickories. So that's shagbark, shellbark, mockernut. There's black hickory, also known as Texas hickory, red hickory, also known as sweet pignut. There's the common or pignut hickory, Cary glabra. There's the scrub hickory, the sand hickory. And then the last one I mentioned here is the nutmeg hickory, Caria myristiciformis, which is actually more basal than all the other species. So I would consider it having more affinities with the Caria section, but it's kind of in between the Apocaria and the Caria section. And then there's another 6 to 7 species in Asia. They're all in the Sinocaria section. The Caricatheensis, Shan Hutao, again, forgive my pronunciation. That's the most economically important. It's also known as the Lenan pecan. Um, And then there were hickory species in on the European continent and in West Asia. They went extinct about 2 million years ago, which geologically speaking is the blink of an eye. So there are nut growers in Europe right now growing things like shagbarks and shellbarks, and these species are doing really, really well. It's kind of like reintroducing a native species. Um, it's considered that the origin of hickories is in North America because that is where the highest diversity is and the highest amount of species, and that's where the center of diversity remains today. So Shagbark Hickory, I'm gonna try to speed up here, but it's very distinctive based on its bark. You can see why it's called Shagbark. Nuts tend to be small, like a quarter in size or less. It's got a pretty extensive range across the eastern US, and you can tell it by the leaflets of 5 that it expresses. Shellbark hickory is a very similar tree, but usually has leaflets of 7 to 9. It's got a more restricted range, similar bark, and a larger nut, generally with thicker shells. Mockernut, I include this one not because it is a commercial species, but I think of all the lesser known hickories that are out there, this one probably has the most potential, primarily as a nut milk species. And the reason why I think that is because the range is so extensive, and mockernut can thrive in acidic upland soils, which is something that the some shagbarks can do that as well, but the shellbarks certainly cannot do that. And so the habitat for mockernut hickory is there are certain environments that are more suited for this species than the other valley species. These lesser known hickory species could have some commercial applications, some agroforestry applications, but you have to ask yourself some questions. And I always try to start with the stance of personal relationship. I mean, ask yourself, do you have a relationship with these species? Do you love them? Are you familiar with them? And if the answer to all of that is yes, then why not find a way to work with them in an agroforestry setting? So here's some questions. Is it abundant in my area? Am I familiar with it? Are they well suited to the habitat of my site when other species may not be, like I mentioned with the mocker nuts earlier? And then, of course, you're going to have to come up with a plan as to how to process them and turn them into value-added product. But I do want to highlight here, while not being a native myself or a member of any tribal communities, the tree crop lineage goes all the way back to the original peoples. So in archaeological sites, the most common charred food remains that they find are charred hickory shells. They're just staggeringly more abundant than any other food resource that has been detected. So hickory trees were by native peoples were certainly passively managed, and then they were certainly actively managed. And so it was sort of an all of the above management approach. One of the best accounts comes from John Bartram, who was traveling in Georgia in 1792, and he wrote this. We then passed over large, rich savannas or natural meadows, wide-spreading cane swamps, and frequently old Indian settlements, now deserted and overgrown with forests. These are always on or near the banks of rivers or great swamps, the artificial mounts and terraces elevating them above the surrounding groves. I observed in the ancient cultivated fields persimmon, honey locust, Chickasaw plum, beautyberry, red mulberry, shellbark hickory, black walnut, which inform us that these trees were cultivated by the ancients on account of their fruit as being wholesome and nourishing food. Though these are natives of the forest, yet they thrive better and are more fruitful in cultivated plantations, and the fruit is in great estimation with the present generation of Indians, particularly Juglans exaltata. Just side note, Bartram didn't put the walnuts and the hickories all in the same genus, but that is translated as Caria liceniosa today, or possibly Caria ovata. So particularly Juglans exaltata, commonly called shell-barked hickory. The creeks store up the last in their towns. I have seen above 100 bushels of these nuts belonging to one family. They pound them to pieces and then cast them into boiling water, which, after passing through fine strainers, preserves the most oily part of the liquid. This they call by a name which signifies hickory milk. It is as sweet and rich as fresh cream, and is an ingredient in most of their cookery, especially hominy and corn cakes. So that's the Pauco hickory, which I mentioned before. And so one thing I want to talk about here about why are hickories so important? So I'm sure you've all heard about the Oak Hickory Forest Association. It's a forest type, and this is extensive all across eastern North America, up into the reaches of southern Canada, where it's known as the Carolinian forest. According to most ecologists, many ecologists, and I would agree with this argument, the oak hickory forest is anthropogenic. It's it's caused it's the result of widespread fire management across the North American continent and more short return fire intervals. So, these kinds of short return fire intervals don't happen without the assistance of humans. So, we've got a huge proportion of the eastern United States, which was shaped by the landscape management practices of the first peoples here. One way to look at this is Native American trading pathways, for example. On the right, you've got what they call the Great Warrior Path. It goes from the Carolinas up into Pennsylvania. Um, and on the bottom is a zoomed in portion of the Pennsylvania part of that in the southeastern quadrant of Pennsylvania. This would be the Muncie Path or um, it's been called other things too. But if a lot of these pathways will follow valleys between mountains, they'll follow waterways, and frequently I will find dense groves of shagbark and shellbark hickory right along these trading paths, especially in association with old Native American settlements, archaeological sites, etc. So to my mind, the evidence is pretty clear. So I'll just give two quick examples. Like I said in my introduction, the nearest city to where I live is Lancaster, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Before it was Lancaster, it was known as Hickory Town because when the first colonists came to the area, they found a great hickory tree above a spring. And the spring had been dug out by human hands and large stones had been placed there. So the water flowed over the stones. And then there was a village of wigwams all around that area. And that was a very important hickory tree for council purposes. So in 1744, during the Treaty of Lancaster, this is when Conisatego, the Onondaga, stood up and basically preached to the colonists the virtues of their democracy. Um, this happened under that hickory tree. Today, that exact area is Penn Square, so it's exactly the center of the town. So all those hickory, well, a lot of the hickories that were in Lancaster County got cut down to build the old Strasburg Road. So they cut them down and then they rived them out. So they were, half they were halved, and the flat side was laid up as the underlayment of the roads. But there are still some of these old legacy trees around. We actually seem to have a sort of a common ecotype, which is a shagbark shellbark hybrid. Um, which you can see on the bottom there. Well, the bottom left is Weicker, which is an old Lancaster County variety, and then the one on the right is Longenecker, which is another Lancaster County variety. Another example is the Tuscarora Path Valley. This is also in Pennsylvania. This is the pathway that was used by the Tuscarora Nation in the early 1700s when they went from the Piedmont of the Carolinas and traveled up to the southern door of the Haudenosaunee in New York to join with what was at the time the Five Nations and then became the Six Nations once the Tuscarora joined. So the Tuscarora Path Valley, now this was an ancient trading path before they used it. They used it because it was there. But that valley is absolutely filled with shagbark hickories, shellbark hickories, chinkapin oak, bur oak, persimmon, honey locust. I mean, they're all there in association. It's pretty neat. So I just call this the cultural forests of North America, and this is sort of taken from William Balliet wrote a book called The Cultural Forests of the Amazon, where he tracks sort of the floristic analysis in association with native cultural groups down there. I consider them similar in importance and similar in nature to the wild apple walnut forests that you find in Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, parts of Kazakhstan. Um, Not that the species are similar. Um, they're I mean, hickories are very different from walnuts, and persimmons are very different from apples, but um, the way you find them in their associations. That area of Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, is central to the Silk Road. So, as all this migration was happening across the Eurasian and Asian continent, a lot of species were coming into contact. Anyway, so what happened after the wake of colonization? So a lot of the prime hickory ground. So hickory is really a valley bottomland species, and that's its native habitat. That's where it really thrives. Whereas you see chestnuts up on the mountains and on the steep hillsides and more acidic north-facing areas, you'll find hickories in the bottomlands where you've got the more circumneutral, rich soil. Picture like garden soil. That's where hickories are, which is also the those were all the prime habitats that were converted into agriculture. And so we lost a tremendous amount of genetic diversity during that process. And what I think happened is that there was a founder effect. So, one of the things, you can see if you spend a lot of time looking for wild hickories is that a really, really good hickory tree, they're few and far between these days. Most of them tend to be quite small, particularly with shagbark, they tend to be quite small. They tend to not always shell out so well, but occasionally you'll find one that's just really big. The kernels just fall right out of the shell of the nut, and um, so to I guess an uncritical perspective, it's tempting to just think that that's just the luck of the draw with genetics, and that this is essentially a wild species that we're talking about, and just occasionally some of them are more accessible for humans. But I would sort of argue an inverse situation where hickory is akin to a semi-domesticated species already in North America because of its long history of relationship with native peoples. But then following colonization, there was this founder effect that selected for fast-growing trees as opposed to good, long-lived nut-producing trees. So if you've ever seen a clear cut a few years later, you see all this tangled thicket of trees emerging, and they'll all be competing and trying to grow quickly and get to the light. And so in that situation, you're selecting for a different genetic expression than those of trees that are growing in more advantageous nurturing conditions. So a lot of these old nut selections from hickory, by and large, they're all wild selections, and a lot of them are older because the further you go back in time, it seems that the hickories were better and better, and that's the consequence of this founder effect. Anyway, I'm going to talk quickly about my influences and um, inspirations. So I mentioned the John Hershey farm. This is John Hershey on that's him at the TVA, courtesy of the TVA archives in Atlanta. Buzz Ferver in Vermont, and he's a good friend of mine. Anyone who knows Buzz knows how tirelessly he works towards fruit and nut exploration and propagation. He's been very generous with a lot of people. And he runs Perfect Circle Farm up in Vermont. So he's in a cold zone, zone 4. So he's doing a lot of cool climate pushing stuff. Parker Coble was a good friend and mentor to me. I met him in fall of 2017, and he passed in 2020. So he's very missed. I only got 3 or 4 years with him, but in that time, I learned a lot. And he was a multi-generational nut grower. His father was Garnet Coble, and Garnet had the foresight to start focusing on the native shagbarks and shellbarks of Pennsylvania because at that time they were completing the interstate highway system, which was finished in 1955. And he knew that the cherry industry, the sweet cherry and sour industry that was based in Adams County, Pennsylvania, would never be able to compete with the Michigan cherries once the highway system was completed. So he pivoted towards the tree crops in his orchard, things that were more suited to his region and that he felt Pennsylvania could continue to compete with. It's also worth pointing out that Garnet Coble knew John Hershey. John Hershey apparently came and stayed on his couch for a hunting trip at least once. There's Fayette Eder, is known as the Luther Burbank of nut trees. This is another contemporary of Garnet's and John Hershey's, and the three men all knew each other. Parker told me a story. Buzz and I took him to Fayette Eder's old orchard before Parker passed, and he told me about how him and his brother used to go there as kids, and they would learn how to graft from Fayette and spend all day working in his orchard. And then Fred Blankenship, he's in Kentucky near Louisville. Uh, he's known as Mr. Hickory, and he's a huge wealth of knowledge and lore, and he's honestly probably got the best collection of hickories that exists in North America. He's sort of an incredible tree tender. Um, and then that gets us into errata and questions. So I'm going to put it here, and I'm going to take a pause and kick it back to Emilie for a moment. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zach. Sweet. So we'll go ahead and kick off the Q&A. I think the first question, just to kind of address the session title itself as well, but you talked a lot about all of the different potential values. Can you maybe tell us how you envision like a new tree economy? What do you like, if you could wave a wand, what would that look like? What's the dazzling dream of the new tree economy?
Yeah, great question. Well, I mentioned the oak hickory forest before, which historically was, in the valleys all the way up to the ridge lines, depending on the habitat and the geology. I'd like to see more oak hickory. I mean, our forests have been undergoing a process of mesification since fire suppression has kind of reigned supreme, and this has resulted in more maple and birch and beech and things like that rather than oak and hickory. But anyway, I would say my big vision is to see hickories in the valleys again. I want to see, I want to follow along the creeks and in the rich fertile valleys and see rows of hickories everywhere. Because that's really what they're suited for, and I think they're such an incredible crop and such an incredible tree. There's a lot of folks planting chestnuts these days, and I think that's wonderful as well. But I think chestnuts are really suited for more of like the north-facing, acidic environments and slopes and the hillsides and things like that, whereas hickories are really great for the bottoms. So I'd like to see a good symbiosis between those two crops, where you see a lot of hickories in the rich bottoms.
Hmm. And what about the economy piece of this? Do you see like a strong future for these as like larger market crops, or do you think are you thinking more along the lines of just working their waves back into the cultural landscape, into homesteading, into just like the common, every plant, people are pretty familiar with and comfortable planting an apple tree, even if they have, a tiny postage stamp lot now. Like, I guess, how do you see hickories fitting into the larger picture?
Yeah, it's all of the above. I'd like to see more interest with hickory trees from a cultural perspective, from a backyarder's perspective, just as something that people love and respect again. I mean, so many people have stories of their grandparents sitting in the garage with black walnuts and hickories in the vise and cracking them out one by one with a hammer, and that it once was cultural knowledge that existed, and it's gone the way of the past while we've leapt head forward into, a new world of technology and industrialization and disconnection. So I'd like the connection piece to come back into the centerfold, but I think a lot of that is also going to involve these larger issues of scale. And that's why I say all of the above, because I think at the same time it's really important that we're innovating new farm tech, that we're growing these trees out in large settings as like part of alley cropping systems where we have long rows of hickories in the valleys and between farmed fields, farmed crops, row crops, and then mechanical ways of harvest, whether that's vacuum harvesters or something else. And also keep in mind, I don't take it for granted that we're going to have the level of technology that we have forever. Um, and we also have to be asking ourselves questions about what a transition into a decarbonized economy looks like. And so by getting more trees out there and getting more cultural interest in these trees, maybe someday we can live in a world where, kids are stuffing their pockets full of hickory nuts as they come home from school every day, and it's just a part of life, whether it's farmed or not.
Yeah, wonderful. It's a beautiful vision. So let's get into some of the wild harvesting pieces because we've got a few questions about that, and we had one in our notes as well. But if you're someone collecting hickories to reproduce a hickory, what are you looking for in a wild tree if you want to grow hickory trees out?
Well, there's a great way to evaluate a hickory, and that's basically to measure the kernel percentage, and then you can also measure the fraction of how easily they shell. So, for example, I get a hickory nut and I put it on my little gram scale, and it says that it weighs 7 grams. And then I crack it out and I take the kernels out and I weigh the kernels, and it says that they weigh 3.5 grams. So 50% of the weight of the nut is in the kernel. So it's a 50% kernel ratio. So that's a really good indicator. Obviously, the higher the number, the better. Sometimes you'll come across a shagbark that can be 51 or 54% kernel. It's pretty rare, but generally a good shagbark is 40% or above, and a good shellbark is like 35% and above. But but there's other factors to consider. So it's not all about shell thickness. There are some really, really good hickory varieties. I'm thinking of Henry in particular. It's a shellbark. It's laterally bearing, just outrageously productive, makes huge nuts. And the shells are kind of thick, but when it cracks open, the nut meat practically falls out of there. And the way that one thing you want to be aware of is how the convolutions in the shell are. Some shells can be very thin, but they kind of pinch the lobes of the nut a little bit and hold on to it. And other nuts can, have a different formation that, has the nut fall freely out. So Henry happens to be one of those nuts, even though the shell is kind of thick. And that actually poses a secondary advantage because since the shell is thicker, the weevils cannot penetrate it as easily. So you hardly see any weevil damage in that variety. A lot of these questions about what is a good nut have to do with human accessibility and how relatable the nut is.
So a moment ago you said laterally bearing. Would you just unpack that briefly?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of hickories bear on the tips of the branches, and then all along the span of the branches, they generally do not bear. So if you can picture like these are the tips of the branches, all the nuts are on the branch tips, whereas a laterally bearing one will have kind of nuts all along the branch. Now, obviously, they're going to be on the they're not growing out of the trunk, they're going to be growing out of
Right.
branch tips, but they go inside the canopy. And so Henry is one of those trees, which makes it much more productive than a tip bearing
It makes perfect sense. Do you
hickory.
want to talk, since you started to touch on it a second ago, talk about just pests and weevils and concerns there in terms of both collecting in the forest or maybe growing on your own?
Yeah, so the weevil is a big issue for anyone growing nuts in the eastern United States. They'll affect chestnuts, they'll affect hickories, I've even seen occasionally they'll affect hazelnuts. First of all, there's a specialist insect, a hickory nut weevil. It's Curculio carriae, and I believe that one exclusively predates on hickory nuts. But then there are some generalist weevils. There's like the greater weevil and the lesser weevil, and they can predate on chestnuts and also on hickory nuts. They tend to emerge in late summer. There are some non-organic ways to deal with that, which I'm not going to talk about. Because I'm a organic guy, but probably the most important thing is just breaking their life cycle. So you want to keep your orchard clean. You want to pick nuts up after they fall off the tree and not let them sit for days or weeks at a time because that gives the weevil larvae an opportunity to emerge and then burrow back into the ground, and then the cycle repeats. There is a genetic factor. Some trees genetically are more weevil resistant than others, Yoder number one, for example, is a Shagbark Hickory variety that is from Ohio near the western Pennsylvania border. It was introduced by Charlie Thatcher. He found it on an Amish farm in Ohio. That one seems to dehiss. In other words, it'll cause those nuts to abort, those that have been infected by a weevil.
Mm.
So when you come to harvest season, harvest time, you're picking up the nuts and they're not weevilled nuts. So that's a good genetic trait that, warrants some attention as far as breeding goes. And then some other factors would have to do with soil nutrition. So it's again, that there's like this is an area where we just need more data. We need more data, we need more research, we need more experimentation. But it seems like using fertilizers like boron, for example, can really increase the calcium availability that the trees have. And that can sort of have the effect of fortifying it against insect predation, such as from weevils. And I don't know, I don't understand all the biochemistry around that. Maybe it probably has to do with some phytochemistry, the volatile aromatic compounds and all of that that the plant produces.
Super interesting. So, we've got a ton of questions about growing. So I'm going to try to
Sure.
group some of these together. So let's start from the ground up. You talked about this a little bit, but if there's anything you want to clarify, I'm just going to give an opportunity now. What makes a good site or a bad site for a hickory orchard?
Yeah, well, great question. And there's two components to that question. One is, what do you mean by a hickory orchard? Because you could be talking about shagbark hickory, you could be talking about shellbark hickory, or a mix of the two. You could be talking about yellowbud hickory, or potentially some of the minor species of hickory. So that's the first question, or the first part of that question. But the second part has to do with the site itself. As I mentioned before, hickories are a bottomland species. You're going to want a soil that's as close to neutral as possible. They tend to thrive about 6.2 to 7.2 is kind of what they do best in. Um, and so often you'll find that in the valley areas, and you'll also find more soil organic matter, more just rich garden-like soil in general in those valley regions. So that's one element to that. The other element is your climatic considerations. Some of these species are going to do better in the north or the south. For example, shagbark hickory is going to be more northern adapted than shellbark hickory, and that has to do with um, there's a whole complex of factors. I mean, people talk about heat units, for example, and that has to do with I think they call it like growing system days or something like that. So in other words, if you've got your last frost date and your first frost date, that tells you something, but it doesn't tell you the whole picture. That just means, it could be 45 degrees consistently in between your frost dates, but that's just not enough heat to ripen a hickory. So hickories really want some summer heat. They want warm nights, they want humidity, um, and but they don't want it to be too hot. So, ideal for hickory growth is kind of like 85 degrees in the day, or maybe 85 to 90 degrees during the day, and then like 55 to 65 at night. So we're really talking about summertime temperatures. Now, in some places, like maybe up in the mountains or far enough north, the window of time where you really get those temperatures can be small. And in that case, you might have some issues. One thing you want to look at is, let's say you're in zone 4, Vermont, for example, you can probably grow shagbark hickories without too much problem. But if you try to grow shellbark hickories, the trees are going to grow, but you might not necessarily ripen a crop. And so that's going to be a question of your variety, your genotype.
So, what is in terms of the hickories, quote unquote, what's the cold hardiest version?
Yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things that needs more data. Certainly, there are people growing shagbark, shellbarks, and presumably yellowbud hickories up into zone 3. I know Diana Beresford Kroger, the author and herbalist, she's in Ottawa, Canada, in Zone 3, and she's got shagbarks and shellbarks. And I think she grew them all from seed and adapted them to produce a crop in her climate. So she's extremely hard to get a hold of, but for those of you who are in those northern zones, she would be worth reaching out to. Like I said, the trees themselves are quite hardy. Even pecan trees should have almost no problems in zone 4. Now that when I say no problems, I mean in terms of winter dieback and twig dieback. Um, the problem is when it comes to ripening a crop. And that's why there's sort of this interest in northern pecans as a as a subject, because you can't take a big fat Alabama pecan and plant it in New York State and expect the same results.
Yeah. We've got a couple questions about silvopasture settings and how
Sure.
they might do in, such full sun and, with potentially high input fertilizer coming from livestock.
Yeah, I don't think the high input fertilizer is a problem. In fact, it's probably a benefit for the hickories, which they all have the capability to bear annually. You'll often hear that they are biennially bearing, but in my experience, that's just a question of metabolics. So you can sometimes find a hickory tree that's on the edge of a fertilized farm field, and it'll consistently produce year after year after year after year. Now, admittedly, not every crop is uniformly the same in terms of volume and productivity. You might have a heavy year followed by a lighter year, etc. But it's very consistent in being annually bearing, and that seems to be a function of nutritional access. In other words, metabolics. So I think you're good um, on that aspect. Hickories love full sun, even though they are shade tolerant. You're going to have a bigger crop with the more sunlight you get. So it's just like anything, just like a persimmon or a pawpaw or a chestnut. They're gonna they're gonna do best with the more sun they can get. Lastly, I would say one of the hidden benefits of hickories and silvopasture, aside from the shade and the occasional food that they offer to livestock in the form of nuts, the curly bark of a shagbark or a shellbark makes a great habitat for our little brown bat. And so a big old hickory tree can be a home for numerous bats. And of course, the bats come out at night and they eat mosquitoes, and that benefits the cattle too. So
Nice. That's a fun detail. Okay, generally speaking, how many years are we looking at until nut production? And then also there was a paired question. And how does its time to bearing impact how we can leverage hickories in our food supply chain?
yeah, great question. So I hate to just keep saying we need more data and we need more experiment. We do have some data on this, but truthfully, we just need more. It needs to be systematized in a better way. But if you go through the old nut growing literature, and if I go through my personal anecdotes of folks I know who have grown hickories from seed, what seems to be the case is that Shellbark hickory grown in full sun in ideal conditions like good, rich bottomland soil, full sun, can bear in as little as 6 years. Um, I would say the range is about 6 to 12 for Shellbark Hickory in full sun. For Shagbark Hickory, there's a little bit of a delay there. It's probably about 9 to 16 years, or 9 to 20 years, something like that. Um, For yellowbud hickory, it's going to be very similar to shellbark, so something like 6 or 7 years to 12 years to first bearing. Keep in mind these are all full sun conditions with proper soil biology. Um, if you grow a hickory in the shade, or if you transplant it a bunch of times or a few times before it's bearing, that can set it back, a few years each time you transplant it. But also, the shade will severely set it back. So sometimes you'll hear this said that, you know, hickories won't bear for 30 or 40 years, and it's sort of it's a half truth. It's not wrong if you're thinking about the perspective of forest ecology. Sometimes a hickory can hang out for decades just waiting for a gap in the canopy before it has an opportunity to shoot up and capture the light and then start to bear. But in an open grown setting, it's really a different situation.
And so the second piece of that was thinking about this time to bearing and how we can leverage hickories in our food supply chain given this long-term, this sort of like long-term investment that we're making.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's why I think it's important to start identifying wild trees and building relationships with them. It's worth pointing out that the pecan industry, now Sam Thayer told me this. I haven't been able to back it up. Um, but he said that even today, the majority of the pecan industry is based around semi-managed wild groves. So if you got out into Texas and Oklahoma and places like that, most of what you're dealing with are, wild groves that are somewhat managed. Sometimes they'll plant improved selections into them. Sometimes they'll cull undesirable trees, but for the most part, it's in that gray area of semi-management. It's really when the pecan industry emerged in the early 20th century and people started planting them in Georgia and Alabama. That's why that became the epicenter of pecan cultivation because they took all the best genetics from the West, brought them east, and um, grew them out at commercial scale. So I would use a similar lesson from history with our emerging hickory industry. We need to just start managing the wild crop resources that we have out there. Um, Now, I know I've talked a lot about non-timber forest products, but hickory is a timber species. And, if you've got a healthy shagbark or shellbark hickory forest, and you want to start identifying which trees should be culled and, which you want to give more room to, that's something that I would give support to. Um, Sort of worst first logging. But yeah, also opening up access to these groves of hickory, making them easier for gatherers to come into, easier to mow around if that's the case, before harvest season. Because we have plenty of hickory nuts that are out there in the ecosystem. It's just a question of leveraging our human labor and knowledge behind that and starting to build a market around it.
Mm-hmm. And I
And
think,
so we could be doing that for the next decade or so in while we're waiting for our orchards to come online.
yeah, absolutely. That's what I was going to just add to that is that, so much of this is going to need to orchard scale things like this and to really bring them to market. We're all playing the long game there. And there needs to be, big grants and big investments in supply chain and marketing to kind of bring the public online. So in some ways, having that gap can be useful because it gives us time to do that back end work too. But I like what you're saying about like filling that gap with opening up more publicly available sources. We're going to switch gear into some food-based questions, and then we're going to wrap up on some ecosystem questions. We've got like a ton of questions, so we'll try to like be brief. But what are the best uses for hickory nut oil, and does it have a nutty flavor?
Yeah, it does have a nutty flavor. I mean, it can vary a little bit. It's rather similar to olive oil. Some people's palate will detect the nuttiness more than others. That's why I say it can vary. Some people consider it very neutral. Other people are like, wow, that's really nutty. I personally find its flavor similar to like a combination of like olive oil with like a more buttery quality and then some of the more complex nutty flavors of hickory. So it's really good. It's probably its best uses as a finishing oil for breads and salads and things like that. Although it is a high heat cooking oil, but at this point in its development, it's more of a precious boutique product. So you might want to think twice about using it as a cooking oil.
And some folks are starting to sell it the toasted version too, which is decidedly nutty and is really nice.
That's right. Yep. There's a lot of ways it can go.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you share a good hickory milk recipe? And is anyone producing hickory milk for sale?
I don't have a specific hickory milk recipe to share other than the general outline of pulverizing the nuts and putting them in water and all that. You'll have to play around with that. I don't know anyone who has hickory milk for sale as a product, but I know it's been talked about. I know the Northern Forest Foods folks up in Vermont, Massachusetts have talked about it. We've been talking about it with the Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative. Bloom Farm in Berks County, Pennsylvania has been talking about it. There might be a limited run of hickory milk available this winter from us,
Right.
and we'll have to see. But probably in future years that'll become more available. I think it's got really good applications for like the coffee industry, the coffee shop industry.
Mhm.
You can have like vacuum sealed packets of pulverized hickory meal, and you can basically run it through an espresso machine and have hickory milk on demand. Um,
That's so good.
yeah.
What's your favorite thing to do with bitternut on like a personal? I assume if I'm thinking this is probably like I don't have an oil press. What can I do with bitternuts?
Yeah, great question. Well, if I didn't have access to an oil press through the co-op, I don't know that I would invest much time in picking up yellow buds, to be honest. There are some home scale presses like the Pytiba. I think that's in the $200 range, maybe. I know people have had success doing that. I know people personally who have had success doing that. It is an oil expeller press that uses a screw, just like the Kerncraft that we use. Um, but it's going to be, you're going to be using elbow grease. So you're turning this thing by hand, kind of like almost like a meat grinder. So you're going to be turning it by hand, and it has a little candle over the sieve just to warm up the material a little bit to get the more efficient extraction. So that's something you could do at home scale.
So we're going to move into some of the more ecosystem questions. So any tips or best practices for regenerating hickory population in timbered areas? While we've planted some in an orchard form, I would like to reintroduce hickory into our pin oak bottomlands.
Oh, great question. I would ask a question in response, which is, do you have like a little nursery you use for such projects? Because probably the best thing to do is to grow them out for 1 year in a nursery setting and then transplant them into the forest where you want them. You can do direct planting as well, but you're really going to have to make sure that those seeds are protected because they're really desirable to the critters, the mice, the voles, the uh, the squirrels, chipmunks, all of them. I mean, raccoons will go for them too. So pretty much, I mean, my dog loves hickory nuts. Who doesn't love hickory nuts? So you just got to really make sure that those seeds are protected if you're going to do a direct planting. But that is a way to go as well.
All right. Someone,
Also,
oh, go ahead.
oh, Doug Tallamy, I think he says that like the best tree to plant for like Lepidoptera and ecosystem benefits is the oak, but I believe that he says the hickory is like number two.
Hmm.
So that's pretty cool.
Okay, question from central Minnesota. Looking to plant hickory and oak in a silvopasture right on the edge of the shagbark range and have abundant yellow buds growing nearby. Would you focus on planting more yellow buds since they're abundant nearby or trying to push shagbark or other hickories further north?
I would recommend both. It depends. I mean, of course, it depends on how much space you have if you're limited on space. The market that's building around yellowbud hickory seems pretty serious. So I don't think that that would be a bad move if you planted all yellowbud. Whereas the market for shagbark is not, at least at this point, doesn't seem as promising as for yellowbud. So if you're going strictly by like market projections, yellowbud would probably be the the safer move because it is a value added product. It is able to be mechanized, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and the market's building for it. But I personally think if you've got the space, you should invest in both of them.
All right. Does it matter which orientation you put hickories into the nutcracker?
It does, but it's not. a one size fits all. Some varieties or some nuts from one tree will crack better end over end, and the nuts from the next tree will crack better side to side.
Okay.
So when I crack a new variety of hickory, and when I say variety, I just mean like an individual, like all the nuts from one tree are a variety, whereas the next one is a different variety. When I crack a new nut, I try it both ways first. I try it end over end, and then I try it side to side, and just quickly, whichever one seems to do better, I'll continue that way.
Mm. The same person asks, they're actively seeking to propagate shagbarks from seed in their nursery, but are finding it to be challenging due to the tree's deep taproots. Do you have any tips?
Yeah, in my experience, the taproots generally won't grow more than 16 or so inches in the first year. Occasionally, you'll have a more vigorous seedling that might grow to be 20 inches or whatever, but it is safe to cut the taproots, or if you're digging them with the tree spade and you end up breaking off the bottom 6 inches or whatever, that's okay. Generally, you want to not cut the root back more than a third of its length. So if you've got 18 inches of root, you'd be okay cutting 6 inches off. That is going to stress the tree. It is going to slow it down a little bit, but when it recovers and it grows, it's going to grow a fork where that cutoff was. So then it'll have two little a forked taproot growing after that. And then if you cut it one more time, it'll sort of give up and it'll focus on lateral root growth. And so in a nursery setting, that's one way to do it, is just to manually dig them up. Grow them one year, and then that fall dig them up, cut the tap roots, put them back, um, and then just keep root pruning them by hand. Some people at an industrial scale will use undercutters or subsoilers off the tractor, and this is basically a giant U-shaped blade that will dig down deep in the soil and basically undercut the tap roots of the trees while they're in place so they can continue growing. Now, if you want to go the containerized route, there are a number of air pruning pots that can work really well. Um, I know Stewie and Sons makes some. I put them in the 14-inch tree pots, so they're like 4 by 14 inches, and then they're Stewie and Sons also makes a 6 by 16-inch pot, and I find that those are perfectly adequate for hickories, at least during the first 5 years or so, or maybe 4 years. I mean, you really don't want to keep a tree like that in a pot that long. But see, one of the issues with hickories and the taproot is that if you haven't managed for the taproot for the first years with manual cutting or undercutting or root pruning, like air pruning or whatever, that taproot is going to become unmanageable in 2 or 3 years. And at which point you're going to be forced to cut the tree in a very dramatic way, somewhere along the taproot. And sometimes that can kill the tree, sometimes it doesn't. But it's certainly going to shock the tree pretty severely. So a lot of times in my nursery, when I'm selling like bare root hickory seedlings, they look pretty small. I mean, they'll be mostly taproot. There'll be 12 to 16 inches of taproot, and there might only be 6 to 10 inches of top growth. And in my experience, because those taproots are uncut, when you plant that tree and let it go in the long term, I think it's going to perform better than if you had a larger tree that had been repeatedly root pruned.
Makes sense to me. Jonathan Dean had asked a while ago if you could go back to the nursery screen on your slide.
Sure. I'll have to share again.
Sure. And while you're looking that up, Evelyn is asking if you can coppice, which you just addressed briefly, but
Yes, you can coppice hickory trees. With coppicing with most hardwood species, the younger the tree is, the more robust and resilient it is in terms of coppicing. So, for example, if a hickory tree is like 30 or 40 years or less, and you coppice it, it's probably going to be just fine. If the trunk is like 16 inches in diameter or less. But sometimes with older growth trees, cutting it down, it will not coppice back if you're going to coppice a tree, especially a larger one, you want to cut it in the winter.
All right. When you're planting new container grown hickory, do you have a specific process for planting? Fertilizer, compost, biochar, anything else?
Well,
And
it depends. I mean, if I'm transplanting into like a bottomland or valley situation where I feel like the native soil is good enough, I won't do anything. But obviously, fertilization is always going to be a benefit. If I had to fertilize, I would just use a mix of compost and biochar and maybe some boron or something if I was going to do mineral fertilization.
okay. So when grafting, what is your preferred rootstock in most cases? Pecan in lowlands and shell further up with shag on the top, or can you push pecan further up slope?
That's a great question. Yeah, there's a lot of nuance to this. And again, I'm going to say we need more data. There's a lot of anecdotes, and that's basically the experience I have to share from. So the conventional wisdom in the nut growing world is that pecan is the preferred rootstock for all hickory. And best I can tell, that conventional wisdom is just based around the observation that pecans are more vigorous. Generally, they're more precocious. Um, so they can grow faster. Um, so you might get time to bearing slightly more accelerated than if you chose a different rootstock. However, I think in the long term, especially because I do a lot of work with these legacy orchards where I come across sometimes grafted hickories that are 100 years old or at least, 50, 60 years old. In the long run, it seems like it's probably better to match the species more closely. So, if you could like shagbark to shagbark is a great combination. Shellbark to shellbark is a great combination. Pecan to pecan is a great combination. What you don't want to do is put a pecan onto a shagbark because the pecan is almost always going to outgrow the shagbark. Um, so what I do is I focus on pecan and shellbark as my two primary rootstocks, and I'll put shagbark onto shellbark, and I'll put shagbark onto pecan. I'll put shellbark onto pecan. I won't put pecan onto shellbark, but I find that shellbark is almost I would say that's probably my favorite rootstock.
Hmm.
Um, I feel like the genetic matching is a little closer for most of the hickory cultivars that are out there. And why the genetic matching is important is when it comes to, like I mentioned about weevil pressure earlier, there does seem to be a metabolic influence there. And I wonder sometimes if like the metabolic pathways that are opened by a pecan rootstock to a shagbark hickory cultivar might be different than the metabolic pathways opened by a shellbark rootstock to a shagbark hickory cultivar. So that's my long spiel about rootstock selection in general. I would say it's pecans are the most vigorous, but not necessarily the most ideal. Shellbarks are almost as vigorous as pecan, but slightly behind, and then shagbarks are not they're the least vigorous of the three. In terms of bottomland versus upland, I would say that the pecan and the shellbark rootstocks are really going to be applicable to the lowland, bottomland situations. If you're in an upland context, you probably are going to want to look at a shagbark rootstock. Although, you can stretch that. I know people have had success growing shellbark and pecan in upland settings, but, it really depends. We just need more data to have a more systematic answers to these things.
All right, we've got two more, Zach. One is I recently purchased bare root yellowbud shagbark hybrids. Do you have experience with them? Will this hybrid still be able to go into the same market as yellowbud nuts?
Yeah, great question. The yellowbud hybrids, like the Carya X lanei is how they taxonomically describe that. The shagbark bitternut hybrids, they're pretty common. They're out there in the wild. I grow a fair number of them. They're untested. They're the sort of the jury's out on these. For the oil market, they're not as good as yellowbud. Pure yellowbud seems to be way better than the hybrid, the bitternut shagbark hybrid for a couple of reasons. For one, the kernel ratio is higher in the yellowbud, and so that makes it easier for the specifications of the machine making the oil. There's something about the geometry of the hybrids, which is not as ideal as the geometry of the straight species yellowbud. So they tend to be a lot harder on the machine. They're inferior for, in terms of like the mechanics of using the machine and getting oil out of them. It's better to have the straight species yellowbud. The other aspect there is I had this slide on the nutritional content of the oil. Basically, what was found from a nutritional analysis that was done is that the ratio of yellowbud hickory oil, so again, this is the straight species, it's about 4 to 1 of the omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids. Whereas in shagbark hickory, the ratio can be 16 to 22 to 1. What we found with the shagbark bitternut hybrids is that the ratio was sort of in between the 4 and the 22. So it was, upwards of 12 to 1. So nutritionally it's less ideal and not as good of an oil.
Interesting. Okay, so here's our final question. Thanks everybody for hanging around. Thanks, Zach, for hanging around. Assuming we're going to miss the 1.5-degree goal for decarbonization, how resilient do you expect hickories and their cousins to be with the coming changes in climate?
Great question. Again, well, there's a lot of diseases out there and pathogens that are affecting, the beech trees. We've got beech bark disease. We've got the beech leaf disease. There's red oak wilt. There's sudden oak death in white oaks. There's canker disease and thousand cankers in black walnut. The other canker in the butternut canker. We've got chestnut blight, obviously. I mean, aside from seeing some badly infected phylloxera on some hickories, which is basically, the equivalent of bad acne, I guess, to the tree. Knock on wood, I haven't seen any really serious hickory blights out there. I've heard that there is maybe somewhat of a hickory blight out in the upper Midwest that comes through every so many decades. Sam Thayer's talked about this, but in my region, in the Mid-Atlantic, I've certainly never seen anything like that. Of course, just because it's not out there doesn't mean it can't develop. I think of all the climatic instability right now, and I think hickory seems like a pretty solid tree. For example, we're losing a lot of ash trees, and hickory is filling those niches, particularly the yellowbud hickory. But shagbark also fills that niche pretty well. So hickory is making some gains in our changing climate and our, increasingly weirding world. In terms of like huge fluctuations in temperature, which is basically what we're going to be looking at. It seems like as the climate warms, it's really the winter lows which tend to become higher, and the nighttime temperatures which tend to become higher, the winter nighttime temperatures. So we might still have polar vortexes and deep freezes and things, which the hickories seem able to tolerate. And if we get hotter summers, now there is a point where, the hickories are going to start to suffer, when temperatures are consistently above 100 and things like that. I guess at the risk of not fully answering your question, that's sort of my thoughts off the top of my head. I think it's about as safe as anything out there that doesn't actively have a blight or pathogen threat.
Well, is there anything you'd like to say to close us out, Zach? To maybe so we're not on a sad note about the progressive weirding of our world, or I liked your verbiage, whatever it was.
Yeah. Well, I mean, before Parker Coble died, he told me that my generation, our generation, is the best he's ever seen in terms of nut growing. And I think one thing that's really encouraging is just seeing how much interest there is in this new old world of nut trees and hickories in particular. For example, like the Northern Nut Growers Association conference has historically been, average age of 70 or 80 years old. And in the last 2 years, we've dropped the average age by like almost 30 or 40 years. So, and there's just like so many young people involved and so much momentum and interest in agroforestry and just deep ecology in general. And I think that's really wonderful. So as long as we can keep riding that wave and lead it into some real cultural changes and ecological changes, I think we're in a good place.
I agree. Thank you so much, Zach. Thanks for being here. Thanks everybody who showed up today. It's a wonderful presentation. Thanks. That was just fantastic.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Take care.
Take care, y'all.